What I'm going to do is take you through the 6 habits today in terms of some of the key principles that I learnt sometimes the hard way, sometimes the easy way in terms of how to implement talent management in an organisation. So starting with end in mind, and I guess in anything in terms of thinking about a strategy and how you might implement something, is trying to really identify first up, what is the business need? What are you trying to fix in the business? What are you trying to make better? Where are you trying to take your business to really? So at that first stage is about creating a clear set of outputs and what you intend to do with them. So what will you do once you've talent mapped all of your critical population? What will you do once you know the strengths or otherwise of your leadership population? And do some of that thinking before you go out there with your story and the proposition, not just to the broader population, but certainly before you talk to your senior directors. What will talent management mean in your company? It could be quite a new concept. People will have very different interpretations of it. It's a bit like coaching, which I do a lot of in my work in consultancy these days. Lots of people have different interpretations of coaching. It's the same for talent management, and it will look different in different organizations. Time frame is critical, so you need to move quite fast these days in organizations to make an impression, and people need to see outputs quite quickly. But some of the research suggests that to fully implement a talent management approach can take up to 3 years to fully implement. We talked already about business need, and we also talked about risk as well as opportunity. So talent management can certainly be a way of addressing risk in your business, particularly of lots of critical roles or specialisms or key people that know a lot about the organization, hold a lot of the intellectual capital and copyright, and actually are really critical to making sure your business delivers. But there's also the risks of not being able to do things, not being able to progress, not being able to keep up with the market, as well as the opportunities. So moving on to our second principle here, it's all about culture. Is your organization ready? Certainly from my experience, when I started going out to 4 businesses within the Bupa stable at the time, they were all in very different states in terms of performance and potential. There wasn't a very great feedback culture if people were underperforming. Nobody talked about careers openly with people, or if people actually made it or they plateaued in their career. There weren't open and honest conversations around that. Ownership of talent management at that point sat with HR because we were trying to implement that approach in the business. But actually, part of our aim came to be, within that 3-year plan, is to move the ownership into the business. So it became part of the approach in the business, part of the business cycle, that looking at our talent, how they were progressing, what return on investment we were getting for our investment in our star people, how was that progressing? And after 3 years, very much the key measure of success for us was that actually the managing director, the senior team, management per se, owned this, and the HR business partners just were there to facilitate that process with the business. Think also about flexibility. Now, I worked in pretty much a white-collar, predominantly female, certainly a UK-based business that, like many UK businesses, was looking to expand overseas. But actually, lots of people in the leadership population at that time had done quite a number of years' service. They'd signed up, almost like the psychological contract was, to work in the UK, to work in a specific office, not to relocate. That was quite unusual, almost unheard of. And certainly moving abroad might be something that over a glass of wine or a beer would sound really attractive to most people, but the reality was quite different. So we had a population that wasn't always that flexible, or indeed we hadn't signed them up to be flexible in terms of thinking about the sort of boundaries or lack of those for their career. It's also about, thinking about the culture in terms of you have to deal with underperformance first. You have to really identify what great performance looks like or what you need it to look like based on shifting priorities in terms of your strategy. So let's look at that a little bit more. Performance or potential was a big question for us. So we started with a very simple conversations, sat around the table as I did with the 4 managing directors for the businesses with their immediate direct reports, talking about the performance of their direct reports, talking about that top layer, heads of population, senior managers, who are responsible for shaping and implementing strategy through layers of management. We talked about them very much, first of all, in terms of performance. Before we got to the talent piece, were they performing at a level that we expected? Were they performing in a way that actually gave us some kind of indication that they could perform at a high level and do some different things, maybe more broadly, or going up in the organization further down the line? Before we got to any conversations about potential, Potential was always quite contentious because potential, do you go down the specialist route? Do you go down a sort of, clear map in terms of leadership potential? Which route you choose, which suits your organization? Now, certainly that's a question that you'll know within your organization, and, your business it may be highly specialist, it may be you need a large leadership population. So really your business should be defined in terms of what potential looks like that will meet the needs of your strategy, meet the needs of your 1, 3, 5, 10-year plans. The way we looked at potential was to look at the people in that critical population just underneath the senior directors and talked about them in terms of who might make director in 1 or 2 years, who could sit in the seat of the current FD, who could sit in the seat of the current MD, who might work in a different size business as part of a development plan. The other key thing about sort of measuring or finding new talent is we didn't go for a highly scientific approach to this. We kept with a very simple 4-box model, and I found the biggest challenge was just to get senior teams around the table and to talk openly about people's potential and performance. So we didn't go into any complex measurements initially. It was about getting that team very, very comfortable with having open conversations about where their people sat, how they're performing, where they saw them going. And that was a real challenge before we even got to any sort of scientific measurement or so. Now, talent mapping is something I think that occupies the HR profession, quite a lot in terms of, seminars and conferences I attend, but also in terms of our day-to-day lives. And I've seen so many different sort of, up to I think a 32 box was the maximum that I saw really. I guess the key thing for me around this is that the boxes are useful in terms of helping people to structure a conversation. Certainly if you're in a culture where it was quite new and quite different for the MD to sit down with her directors to talk about performance, you need something that gives people a mechanism or a framework that they can work with. So the 4-box worked really well for us initially, and it got the conversation flowing, and it really highlighted not just in terms of what was going on with our senior leadership population, but we could start to look at that picture and look at that and an overall picture of our strategy and decide where we had gaps or opportunities or challenges. We may have a really highly ambitious sort of strategy, but if most of our people were sort of middle-of-the-road performers, how would we get there? And we evolved into a 9-box eventually because the questions became a bit more complex. We needed to break down critical populations in different ways, but still the same applied. Don't tie people down to boxes. Do look at your strategy, and what that box tells you is not just where people are sat in the box, but actually will the current population you've got deliver what you need as a business? I guess the key principle for me on this at the end of the day is don't get too hung up on your boxes. Even in the most technical of populations, do try and have that more strategic conversation alongside the detail of who goes where. Now, transparency is always a key issue. How many times might you have sat there and thought about, do we tell Susan that actually she isn't going to make managing director when she's been on a growth trajectory towards that role for the last 5 years? Do we talk to David about opportunities from abroad when actually we don't know if David is mobile? Now, certainly in the early days of implementing this, we very much decided with the senior teams that actually we weren't going to be that transparent about names and boxes. We were going to be very transparent about the fact that we did talent mapping, and that also that we targeted development spend where people sat on that talent map and where we thought it was the best investment for the organization and individual to realize their strategic aims. But in the past year or two, sort of at the end of our 3-year initial implementation, we brought in something called career development discussions. And these were very much a 2-way conversation, sitting outside of the annual performance management review, and very much focused on people, their careers, their development and their futures. And we did that with our board in the UK, and then worked through several levels, probably top 3 levels in the organization, where we had our most critical players, the people who are really, movers and shakers in the business and accountable for delivering the business outcomes. And we sat down with people and literally talked to them about their career aspirations, talked to them about what they did want to do, talked to them about mobility and aspiration. And things like mobility, sometimes, there are stages in lives where sort of, we aren't very mobile. There are all sorts of practical implications for having the conversation with people about what's doable right now. And the fact that was a 2-way conversation, so the individual got the opportunity to input as well as the senior manager sat with the individual talking to them about the expectations of the business, produced some really great results. And in fact, what we thought might be a risk of losing people, we didn't lose anybody in maybe sort of 50 to 75 conversations at that level. And everyone to a person said it would be one of the most valuable conversations they'd ever had. Because my argument would be that in terms of our most talented, the answers that they need are, how am I performing? How am I viewed in a senior level? What's my future? And I think anyone in terms of, reasonably ambitious, somebody who's quite driven, somebody who's got that inner sort of like craving in terms of succeeding in what they do, they're critical questions. And very often organizations just don't have the conversation. But you can understand the risk in your business. We got to understand it in ours over a period of time. And then you decide your implementation approach. Selling it to management, how do we go about doing that? And I think in terms of the first 5 principles, there are lots of things that you could pull on there. And from practical experience, I know that actually implementing some of those steps, having a regular dialogue, working with your senior management team, the directors, to implement the approach, that's the critical part. But what do you do in terms of approaching, as I did, 4 MDs who've never done talent management in an organization that had never done it? And literally, when I went to talk to them, I talked about their business. I talked about their strategy. I talked about what they needed to do, their frustrations with their business from a people perspective. And we talked about capability to deliver what they needed through their people. And always worked on that basis, and then introduced a talent management approach. But always keeping the manager director's eye on the ball in terms of, from a HR perspective, we've got a talent management approach that will effectively deliver the capability so that you can deliver on the strategy. And that's what they're in business for. That's why they're MD. Their sole function is to get the organizations to deliver that strategy.